Okay, so I can see the slides and I'll start with my lecture. Again, welcome to all the participants to this lecture in continuation on mythological paradigms, and we are exploring Greek mythology and its relevance in contemporary literature. So today we'll be looking at one of the most, you may say, challenging and complex theme in literary tradition in terms of psychology, which is the descent into the underworld. So today we have our lecture on mythological underworlds and psychological depths, and we'll be exploring Greek conceptions of modern life and modern psychological parallels and afterlife. And if we look at from Homer's Odyssey to Dante's Inferno and even Milton's Paradise Lost and even contemporary works by Margaret Atwood, we will find that this catabasis is known as the underworld journey in Greece. It is called catabasis. It remains a fundamental narrative structure because it maps the deepest territories of human experience. So today we'll be exploring that what makes Greek underworld literature particularly fascinating, and how these ancient texts have anticipated modern psychological insights about trauma, about consciousness, about healing, and will not be simply just reading adventure stories or religious allegories. We will be encountering sophisticated literary explorations of human psyche that has continued to influence how we understand both literature and psychology in the present times. So, our lecture today will examine four key areas. The first will be that how Greek literary text construct the underworld as a kind of psychological landscape. Secondly, that how major literary figures they function as psychological archetypes that appears across literary traditions, and we'll also be exploring that how descent narratives provide structural templates for literary works about transformation, about healing, and finally, we will understand that how contemporary literature continues to employ these ancient patterns to explore modern psychological themes. So, with this, we'll be moving to our first slide, which is the literary construction of psychological space. So, we'll be starting with Hades, the god of underworld. So, in book 11 of the Odyssey, Homer creates what may be called as Western literature's first detailed psychological landscape. So, when Odysseus descends to Hades, he is not simply consulting the dead, but he is entering a literary representation of memory, of trauma, and unresolved psychological material. So Homer has used this device which is known as Nekia, Nekuia, which is pronounced as Nekia, which is the ancient device used to summon and question ghosts. It is used as a literary device. The Nekia is used as a literary device. Again, I'll repeat the meaning of it. It is an ancient device which is used to summon and to question ghosts. So Homer's underworld. Homer's the way he has described Odysseus' underworld visit, it follows a precise literary structure that becomes a template for psychological exploration in literature. So, very first thing which you will find is the ritual preparation. So, this is the very first element. So, we can see that Odysseus must perform specific rituals like digging the pit, making offerings. So, in literary terms, this represents the careful preparation necessary for accessing traumatic or you may say repressed material. Now, notice how this pattern appears in later literature wherever character must confront their deepest fears or memories. Now, following this digging into the past, or better known as ritual preparation, it is followed by controlled summoning. Now, what is controlled summoning? Odysseus controls which spirits he speaks with, keeping others at bay with his sword. So, this literary technique represents the necessary boundaries in psychological exploration. So it is basically assessing specific memories or traumas while maintaining protective barriers to those memories and traumas which you don't want to access, or maybe which is not important for your psychological exploration. And the very final step is the hierarchical encounters. So we have seen that Odysseus, he speaks first with Elpenor. Elpenor stands for recent trauma, then with his mother, which establishes their family relationships. Then he also speaks to Prophet Tiresias. Tiresias is an example of wisdom and guidance. And finally, he speaks to various heroes. So various heroes, they manifest the cultural memory. So this progression, it mirrors that how psychological processing often moves from recent events to more deeper and more archetypal material. And Homer has also very beautifully, while depicting Hades, he has also very beautifully used literary imagery as psychological metaphor. So we will find that Homer's description creates a kind of vocabulary that later writers will use and even have used to represent psychological states. So what are these literary vocabulary? The first is blood. Blood is represented as life force. So the spirit's need for blood to speak represents that how repressed memories require some kind of emotional energy to be accessed and to be processed. Then he has also used elements like shade and substance. So shade and substance is used to create you may say distinction between the living flesh and the ghostly forms. And this distinction, it becomes a literary metaphor for the difference between the conscious awareness and unconscious memory. So the shade, it stands for ghostly forms, it stands for the unconscious memory, and substance, it stands for the living flesh, it stands for the conscious awareness. And then he has also introduce this inability to embrace. So we have seen that Odysseus' failure to embrace his mother, it represents the literary theme of incomplete mourning and unresolved grief. So these patterns and these small elements have been used vividly by the contemporary writers to emphasize on the psychological depth and psychological understanding of the afterworld. And then after Homer, we have also Virgil. So Virgil has a very unique architectural innovation in the Aeneid. So what Virgil does, he transforms Homer's relatively simple underworld into an elaborate literary architecture that maps psychological processes with unprecedented sophistication. So we have very important, we have Sibyl as a act as a literary guide. So Sibyl represents the inspired poet prophet who can guide readers through psychological complexity. So her presence establishes a literary tradition of the wise guide, which we have later also seen in Dante's Virgil, and even in Dickens' spirits and countless mentor figures. And what Sibyl come across, she comes across as somebody who helps to navigate psychological territory. So Virgil's creation of Sibyl has been later used by the contemporary writers dealing with psychological narrative to create a mentor who helps you to understand psychological territory. And then Virgil has also used the golden bow, and Virgil's golden bow, it becomes one of the literature's most powerful symbols for psychological readiness. So the characters, they must earn the right to descend through proper preparation, a literary principle, and that also appears in text like Sir Gawain and Green Knight, to the heart of darkness, to the road, that you must have this proper, you may say, preparation, the proper mindset, which is described as golden bow, to descend into the psychological realm deeper and deeper. And then Virgil has also very uniquely created distinct literary spaces and which represents diverse psychological states. For example, he has represented grieving fields. So, where grieving fields was where those who died from love reside. So, grieving fields, it becomes a literary space representing the psychological territory of romantic trauma. Then he has also featured fields of war. So, fields of war is where the warriors process the psychological aftermath of violence. And very importantly, Virgil has also presented Elysium. So, Elysium, it represents a literary representation of psychological integration and space. So, this geographical approach of using landscape to present different psychological aspects and different psychological states, it becomes fundamental to later literature. Now, if we have to relate this to contemporary literature, we can relate the Moors in the Wuthering Heights. We can relate to Thames in the Heart of Darkness, and we can also relate to different districts in the Hunger Games. So it represents one or the other kind of this literary territory, which could stand for either the romantic trauma or the aftermath of war violence or the Elysium. So very uniquely, Virgil has used the landscape, the you may say different forms to represent the various aspects of psychological dimension. And then we also have Ovid's version of this myth. So we have Ovid's Orpheus and Eurydice, which is this myth has become a meditation on the relationship between the artistic creation and the psychological healing. So Orpheus represents the artist who can move even the stones of the Hades with his poetry, yet he fails in his personal relationships. So this literary archetype that appears in countless works about the cost of artistic dedication. Orpheus was so much dedicated in his craft that he ignored the simple rules set up for him. If you do not know the story of Orpheus and Eurydice, then very briefly I'll tell you that Orpheus was a great artist and Eurydice was his lover, and she died because of a snake bite, and Hades takes her to the underworld. Now, Orpheus goes to the underworld to regain back his lover, and he has a very powerful, you must say, very mystic, artistic form. So he influences Hades and everyone with his artistic form, and Hades even agrees to send Eurydice back with him. But Hades has put a condition that Eurydice will walk behind you, and you do not have to turn back. Do not have to give a backward glance to Eurydice. And Virgil's ignore unconsciously he ignores this condition, he turns back and he lost Eurydice forever. So this becomes this backward glance, it becomes a powerful literary symbol for the way of premature analysis or interpretation, which can destroy the very thing we are trying to preserve. So this backward glance of unconscious ignorance of simple rule, it becomes a theme that has appears in multiple of work. For example, the turn of the screw to atonement. We also have look back in anger and all. So these movements and all this, these are inspired from this backward glance, which was beautifully created by Virgil. Can you please move to the next slide? Yes. So uh, now we'll move to the literary archetypes and character functions. So we have seen that how the great writers, the Homer, the Virgil, and Ovid, have used literary techniques to create a psychological understanding and psychological dimension of in the Greek mythology. Now we also have various literary archetypes through character and how these character functions to represent different psychological pattern. So very first we have Persephone. So Persephone represents the complexity of divided self. So Persephone myth establishes one of the most important character archetypes, which is the figure who exists simultaneously in two worlds. So this literary pattern, it appears across genres and periods because it represents fundamental sorry, it represents fundamental psychological experience of trauma and of recovery. So if we look at the literary evolution of Persephone archetype in medieval literature, so the maiden who must spend time in otherworldly realms, she becomes representative of those maiden also. Then in Gothic literature, we have heroines who were trapped between the worlds of reason and madness. Very famous example is of Bertha Mason. So Persephone myth continues to be resonated through Bertha Mason because she was trapped between the reason and unconsciousness, something which is very similar. Persephone, she was trapped between the worldly life and the other worldly life, very similar to Bertha Mason. And then also in Victorian literature, we have this Persephone myth articulated through those women characters who must negotiate between the public and private self. For example, we have Jane Eyre, we have Tess of the D'Urbervilles. So they have to negotiate between the divided self. And then also in modern literature, we have characters dealing with multiple cultural displacement. We have characters dealing with xenophobia, identity fragmentation, gendered divided self. So you can see the evolution of Persephone myth. The very fundamental myth of divided self resonated in modern literature right from medieval to the contemporary literature, mostly through women characters, and very significantly exploring the psychological complexity and depth of having two kinds of life. And then Persephone has this pomegranate seed as her symbol. This pomegranate fruit was given to her by Hades as a reminder of their eternal bond. So the detail of Persephone eating pomegranate seed becomes a recurring literary motive, representing the way the experiences leave permanent marks on the character. So if we look at the dimensions of this pomegranate seeds, so you will find that there are mad woman's laughter in Gothic novel, and then we have shell shock, we have immigrant permanent displacement, we have trauma survivor. Now you have to understand that how pomegranate seeds are related to these experience. Pomegranate seed, it stands for the continuation of your divided self. As I've told you, this pomegranate seed was given to Persephone by Hades. So this seed represents the continuation of some kind of otherworldly trauma. Now, this pomegranate seeds, which is the representation of divided self or other worldly trauma, transformed into the laughter of a woman, which is often criticized, and women have suffered because of their laughter. If we look at the example of Draupadi, if we look at the example of other characters, so they smiled, they laughed, and then they suffer. So this is how pomegranate seed, it becomes symbolic of some action which represents your divided self, and you continue to bear the consequences. So just like this symbolism, you have veteran shell shock characters. Very famous one is in Septimus Warren Smith and Mrs. Dalloway. Then the continuation of divided self is also represented in displacement narratives in post-colonial literature. Then we also have traumatic memory in the normative literature. Like there must be a character who has undergone through trauma. When the character comes back to normal life, the traumatic memory stays. So traumatic memory is interpreted as a kind of pomegranate seed of Persephone, which was given by Hades. So this is how these two are related. That pomegranate seed, it stands for the extension of the divided self memory, and this features of displacement, of continued trauma, of mad woman's laughter, it is symbolized, or it is, you may say, paralleled to this pomegranate seed which was gifted by Hades. And then we also have Hades, who represents what literature often needs, which is a powerful figure who embodies what characters must confront, but they cannot simply defeat. So, unlike Zeus or Poseidon, Hades cannot be overthrown. Hades represent that aspect of psychology or that aspect of psychological dimension that you cannot defeat, but that should be negotiated with. So if we look at Hades, so Hades evolved into this necessary antagonist. So if again, just like pomegranate seed, we have to understand that Hades is symbolic of something. Like pomegranate seed is symbolic of continued trauma or continued memory. Hades is symbolic of something which you cannot defeat but you can negotiate with. So if we talk about what are these something, so the very first thing is the necessary antagonist. So we have figures like, if I have to give example, yes, we have figures like in Heart of Darkness we have Kurtz, or we have kind of Rochester's first wife in Jane Eyre. So these are the characters which protagonist cannot defeat, but they have to negotiate with this character. So this is the symbolic understanding of Hades. So he represents that aspect of your psychology which cannot be defeated, but you must confront them and you must have but you must negotiate them. So the very first aspect is the necessary antagonist. Second is second, sorry, dimension of Hades is Hades also represents those literary figures who possess knowledge that protagonists need but can only obtain through psychological risk. For example, Dr. Faustus. So Hades is also interpreted as keeper of secret knowledge. So Dr. Faustus wanted that knowledge, but he knew that this knowledge, the knowledge of necromancy, the knowledge of occult science will not come easy. So Hades also represent that kind of knowledge which is detrimental, which is damaging to have. Now this knowledge also stands for the psychological, you may say, confrontation. The character must be having some kind of experience which they want to run away from, but if they cannot, if until and unless they confront those experiences, they cannot come over those experiences. So this is a kind of secret knowledge which is also represented through Hades. And then Hades also represents transformation because he's the god of underworld. So he also represents a kind of change. Now this change is not simple. This change comes through the confrontation with difficult truth. So the moment you have crossed the threshold of normal world, the moment you have confronted your unwanted truth or unwanted reality, the transformation which took place, that is also represented by Hades. And then after Hades, we have Orpheus. So Orpheus basically, it represents the psychological healing power through any creative form or through any artistic form. So Orpheus establishes that literary archetype whose creative power can heal psychological wounds, but at a great personal cost. So we have many brilliant literary manifestation of Orpheus myth. For example, romantic poets. So these romantic poets, they have, you may say, access to transcendent experience, but it comes with profound psychological suffering. And then we also have many sorry, is there any confusion? Is there any confusion? Okay, I'll continue then. Yes. Then we also have many Victorian artist figures like Felix Holt and Daniel Deronda, who use their talent to heal social wounds. But those who are the healers, they must have suffered some kind of great suffering. So again, there is a repetition of Orpheus myth that the healer himself has great personal suffering, and but he uses his suffering, he channelizes his suffering for the healing of others. And then we have like modern artist healers, like characters in Virginia Woolf, James Joyce, who use their artistic consciousness to process psychological material. And then following this Orpheus myth, we have very important aspect of psychological dimension, which is the backward glance. I've told you the significance of backward glance. It came from the Orpheus myth. Now, the fatal backward glance, it becomes a very crucial literary device representing the moment when analysis, when confrontation, when a reality destroys the experience. So, this structural element of backward glance, it appears in narrative movements where characters' self consciousness undermines their happiness. It is kind of comment on their own artifice. It is like the stories that attempt to preserve or understand something that destroys it. So, backward glance, we can very simply understand it is the movement of awareness, it is the movement of consciousness that is a confrontation that destroys the otherwise maybe hypothetical normal order. So, this backward glance, it becomes very important. And can you please change the slide? Yes. Now we have very important aspect of Greek literature, which stands as a very important symbolism of psychological realm, which is catabasis. So catabasis, I've already told you, it is the journey into the underworld. It is the descent into the deeper realm. Now Greek catabasis, it establishes a literary structure that continues to organize works about psychological transformation. So, if you take up any psychological narrative, if you take up any work of psychology, let's say stream of consciousness or anything, you will find that the catabasis structure is very religiously followed. So, this catabasis structure has three acts to it, three aspects to it. Sorry. The very first aspect is the necessary descent. So it starts with necessary descent. So what is this necessary descent? It is a kind of recognition, it is the kind of understanding that surface level solutions are inadequate, the most easy and simple probable solutions are inadequate, and then this realization, it calls for the adventure to becomes a kind of psychological exploration. So, moment the character realize that he has to confront the deeper fears, he has to go deep into the fears in order to understand. So that initiates the call for exploration, and that realization that a descent is important, a deeper understanding is important. This symbolizes the first level, which is the necessary descent. Now, then there starts the process of gathering of tools and allies. Like you need literary guides, you need somebody to guide you, you need somebody to help you. So this necessary descent, this first dimension has three aspects. The first aspect is realizing that there is no solution, there is no easy solution. Second, the hunt for solution by going back, by going deep into the psychological exploration. And third, gathering tools and the mentors to help you guiding through the psychological journey. Now the second aspect is confrontation with the depths. So confrontation with the depths, it involves kind of encounters with increasingly challenging psychological material. So it also require basically the test to face rather than avoid difficulty. And it this test, it results to transformation of the protagonist through engagement with fear, and through engagement with those experiences which the protagonist must have been avoiding. So this is the second aspect. The second aspect is confrontation with the depths, and the first and the final aspect is return and integration. Now, after confronting the fear and overcoming the fear, the challenge of bringing insight back into the ordinary consciousness, this is the most important aspect of written. So, the changed relationship between the protagonist and their world, with the protagonist having evolved awareness and self consciousness, and the cost and benefit of psychological knowledge. So, this all these elements, they involve the trauma of return and integration. Now if we look at the literary application of catabasis, so we can find the application into the epic literature. So, like Beowulf, descent into the mere in order to emerge back. The Beowulf's confrontation with the and comes back with the knowledge, and then we have in through hell and Paradise Lost journey through hell. It represents the very classic, the epic example of the use of catabasis structure to explore the cultural and spiritual transformation. And then also in the Gothic literature, the Gothic novels, they constantly and consistently they employ underworld imagery like crypts, like underground chambers, and these crypts, these underground chambers, they kind of they act as spaces where psychological truths are confronted. So Gothic heroine's journey into the depths of the castle, it is paralleled with the Greek hero's journey into the Hades, which is symbolic of journey deeper into the realm, confrontation of the fears, confrontation of the impossible or difficult solutions. And then also in Bildun's Roma, the coming of age novels, we can see very, very effective use of catabasis structure with protagonist descending into the psychological complexity before emerging as transformed. So if we think of Great Expectation, the Pip's journey through moral underworld, it establishes the structure of catabasis. And then we also have Jane Eyre's Night into the Red Room, which is also the example of catabasis. And even in the modern psychological fiction, the writers like Virginia Woolf and James Joyce and William Faulkner, they have used this technique of a stream of consciousness to create literary descents into the character psychological depths. So this very beautifully, it establishes the use of catabasis as a literary structure. And then, ma'am, can you please come to the next slide? Yes. So we have seen that how this catabasis, if we talk about Greek psychological literature, apart from all the dimensions, the character archetypes and everything, catabasis stands as the most powerful literary device of psychological exploration and a psychological narrative. Now, if we talk about the modernist innovation in underworld literature, which has passed down from Greek mythology, so we'll see that very first Virginia Woolf has used Greek psychological framework, and she has evolved them into psychological realism. So what Woolf does, she transforms the literal underworld journey into the stream of consciousness, into the exploration of consciousness in itself. So if we talk about Mrs. Dalloway, so we have Septimus Warren Smith's psychological descent, which is parallel with Clarissa's more subtle journey into memory and identity. So the novel's structure of moving between the surface events and psychological depths, it recreates the pattern of catabasis in modernist form. And then also Wolf's innovation lies in showing that how ordinary conscious experience, or that how ordinary consciousness contains underworld territories. So the party in Mrs. Dalloway, it becomes a space where psychological depths are assessed through social interaction, through memory, and through artistic arrangement. So catabases have been strategically and beautifully used by Virginia Woolf to follow the very, you may say, Greek structure of psychological descent. And then we also have James Joyce Ulysses. So James Joyce, he very explicitly parallels Homer's underworld episode in the Hades chapter, where Leopold Bloom attends Paddy Dignam's funeral. But you may say Joyce's true innovation lies in showing that how every moment of consciousness, that every second of being aware, it involves descent into psychological depth. So he has used this stream of conscious technique as a literary method for representing the constant, the never ending flow between the surface awareness and deeper psychological material. So he has emphasized that every second of our thinking, we descend into the more subtle, more deeper psychological level. So what he does, he makes the reader, with every word, with every experience, he makes the reader experience databases from within. So this is a very unique innovation by James Joyce, where you do not need any particular movement, you do not need any particular memory or any particular instance for catabasis, but he emphasized that every thought, every second, every, you may say, journey, every day, every second, every time you experience this journey into the descent, and you experience catabasis everywhere. So his reader, they read, if you have read James Joyce, you can very much relate to it. The more you read, the more you think. So this reading and thinking is the journey into catabasis. It is the structure of catabasis. And then we also have very, you may say, post-colonial literature, which with exploration of catabasis as cultural underworlds. So if we talk about the most important one, according to me, it is Jean Rhys White Sargasso Sea. So Rhys imagines the Persephone myth through the lens of colonial trauma. So Antoinette's journey from Caribbean childhood to English madness, you can see that it follows the catabasis pattern, like with her descent, representing not just personal psychological trauma, but the collective trauma of a displaced community, of the cultural displacement. So this novel's structure of moving between the Caribbean abundance and English confinement, it, you may say, it recreates or it resonates Persephone's seasonal journey, and this journey is used to explore that how colonial violence creates psychological underworlds, where you can fit in this framework of catabasis to explore the more deeper realms of psychological dimension and psychological reality. And then we also have this very brilliant use of catabasis into Toni Morrison's Beloved. So Morrison's novel represents one of the literature, you may say, most powerful use of underworld imagery to explore significantly a historical trauma. So the house at 124, you can say that it becomes a space where the psychological underworld of slavery, it emerged in the form of ordinary reality. So beloved herself, she functions as a figure from the psychological underworld. Now, this figure has come from the psychological underworld, and beloved represents both individual and collective trauma that demands recognition, that demands integration, and that demands acknowledgement. So the novel structure, it very uniquely follows the catabasis pattern, as these character, the every character is required to confront rather than avoid this traumatic material. So Toni Morrison's Beloved, it becomes a very brilliant example of Greek catabasis structure, of understanding the psychological narrative and the psychological dimensions in literary application. And then we also have many contemporary fantasy, psychological realism, like Neil Gaiman's American Gods. And then we also have Margaret Atwood's Penelopead. So you will see that all these novels, all these psychological narrative, they follow the very fundamental Greek catabasis structure. And we have many trauma literature also. That trauma literature very prominently and very significantly, or rather very directly, it takes up the catabasis pattern, because you have this catabasis structure in trauma literature. It provides a literary framework for representing psychological journey from trauma through confrontation and finally to processing the integration. So trauma literature, any kind of trauma literature, it beautifully manifests the catabasis pattern. Ma'am, can you please change the slide? Yes. Now we have we'll come to this literary technique. We have talked in depth about catabasis, and we'll talk about the literary techniques, which helps to influence reader psychology and psychological narrative. So the very first dimension is that how this underworld literature it affects reader. So if we see that Greek underworld literature it establishes techniques that continue to create, you may say, powerful psychological effects. So very first is catabasis, because catabasis is the, you may say, core of Greek psychological literature. So catabasis is presented as vicarious. So reader they experience psychological descent through identification with characters, and this allow them to process their own psychological material safely through literary experience. And then we also have cathartic structure. So the movement from descent through confrontation through return, it creates a more cathartic experience for readers. It's a kind of emotional release that Aristotle has defined as central to dramatic effect, and it greatly affects the reader. And then we also have a kind of symbolic resonance, like in underworld imagery. It continues to resonate with the readers because it represents the universal psychological experiences. So, what are these universal experiences of confronting fear, of processing any kind of loss, of integrating with difficult experiences? So these underworld literature it helps reader to psychologically release themselves by identifying through characters and to accept their reality. Now if we talk about contemporary applications of this psychological, you may say, psychological narrative, then many critics have claimed that this psychological narrative it kinds of enhances the therapeutic reading, because contemporary writers have explicitly used literature's capacity to guide readers through psychological territories. So you can find there are books prescribed to help readers to process specific psychological challenges using the structural support of literary narrative. And as somebody, we are coming from academic background, if we study the post colonial narrative, if we study the post colonial works, so automatically we kind of get a therapeutic understanding because we have come across that experience. So it creates a shared understanding, it creates a shared healing bond between the reader and the writer. And then we have memoir and autobiographical fiction, which acts like a kind of psychological relief because they use the psychological narrative as a structure to organize autobiographical material about trauma, about recovery, about acceptance, and about moving on. And a very important aspect of this psychological narrative is that the reader is used as a psychopomp. So, what is a psychopomp? Psychopomp is a Greek literary figure, is a Greek literary device, and it is a guide that leads soul into the afterlife. So the contemporary literary theory, they basically recognize readers as a psychopomp, like readers themselves, they function as guides through psychological territory for both the characters, because they identify through characters and they have empathy through characters, and also for the other readers because there is a kind of shared experience, shared interpretation, and shared discussion of the experience they are talking about. So very interestingly, the modern psychological narratives, they have treated readers as a psychopomp, where reader becomes the guide through traumatic experience, through psychological journey, and finally to help integrate the writer and the other readers into back to the normal. This is a very very important aspect of psychological fiction. And then to conclude, if we talk about the you may say relevance of Greek underworld literature, so it endures, like it provides a tested literary technique, because whatever I have told you, from the devices to the techniques to the structure, it has it has proven tested for representing the most fundamental experiences. And what are these fundamental experiences? Of confronting the fear, of processing the loss, of integrated learning through suffering. So, every effective piece of literature about psychological change, whether we talk about Hamlet's encounter with his father's ghost, or contemporary novel about recovering from any kind of trauma, it employs a structural and symbolic elements that Greek writers were first to develop. So when you encounter any distinct imagery in the literature, you can now, after this lecture, I hope, you can very well relate it to the Greek databases structure, the Greek archetypes, the Greek character archetypes, and you can see that every literary tradition has used these structure, these archetypes to create a real psychological ascent. So we can say that this underworld of Greek literature, as in psychology, is not separate from ordinary life, but it is a kind of hidden foundation of psychological narrative. So it is a deep structure that supports, and it helps make possible all the fundamental human experience to be expressed through literary forms. And great literature, it often helps us to recognize this depth and provide the necessary literary tools for navigating it successfully. So with this, I end my lecture. If you have any question, you can please ask.